Hour. Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, maybe some places. I don't see anybody who's in East Asia in my list. Thank you for making it. So this is meeting number 2 of our GenDispatch interims. You will notice that this is, in fact, an IETF meeting. So the guys, please do. If you have never read the note well, I hope everybody here has, please do go find it and make sure that you agree with all of the things that you have to follow to participate in this meeting. The meeting is being recorded. We're going to record the WebEx session and use that to go through for later to make sure the notes are good. And if you want to go take a look at this later, you can. And we do have a virtual blue sheet going right above where I'm talking to the minutes here. Please go to codemd.ietf.org/mumble, which is in the Jabber room and in the WebEx chat, and sign your name. If you would go to the main codemd.ietf.org webpage and sign in using Data Tracker, that would be helpful to all. And what else do I have to say on my little list here? I wish I didn't have to, but let me just put a reminder up at the top that during IETF conversations, we're going to try to be respectful, which means we don't try and characterize the motives of other IETF participants. We don't try and characterize IETF participants in general. We're talking to the issues. We're not talking about the people. Just a reminder. We are going to, we've got, hopefully, 1, 2, do I see one of the third authors in the room? Not at the moment. We're going to try and pick up where we left off last time. For those who were not at the last meeting, please do feel free to, up at the top of the agenda here, ask clarifying questions of authors who are present. And we're not going to go through the presentations. They were very short presentations last time. And I'm going to assume that everybody has read the 3 documents that we're discussing and knows sort of where we are. The discussion itself should be kept on the content along the lines of, what should the IETF work on? And if so, where that work should take place. We're not trying to solve the problem that each of the documents proposes. We're simply trying to decide how to dispatch it. That's the big issue here. What we're looking for is what would be a satisfactory output for this discussion, whether we think a BCP out of the IETF is desirable, whether we think an informational document, updates to the RFC style guide, changes to the NITS tool, GenArt review, something similar to the W3C manual. We've already gone through the Jabber logs, the mailing list. We've got a summary that you can read further down here, and there was a nice set of presentations last time. You can take a look at those. They're each just a couple of pages. And yes, did someone have a question? Or was someone just toggling their mute button? Sorry. Okay. And I think that's where I want to leave it. We'll start with, does anybody have anything directly for the authors? Maybe they weren't at the last meeting or wanted to clarify with direction. Otherwise, I posted the summary last time to the list. Oh, by the way, Francesca is being our minute taker for the meeting. Thank you, Francesca. But if you would stay in CodeMD and help her by clarifying what you said, clarifying what you heard others say, the more the merrier as far as adding to the discussion on the CodeMD page for when we do the minutes. So that would be very helpful. If you take a look at the summary I did for last meeting that I posted to the GenDispatch list, that would probably be useful to your understanding of what's going on. But we did have a sense for a couple of things where the outcome of that discussion got to. We'd like to clarify some of those moving forward. We want to understand, we got a sense of the room the first time that people started from, oh, I think an AD sponsored document would be good, but seemed to be shifting toward either a BOF or even a little more support for some sort of short working group. There were definitely some people who thought we shouldn't go forward with a document in this area. We didn't get a good sense for whether people were feeling on any of the given choices. I definitely want this one and I can't live with any of the others, or this is my preference, but I can live with others. So we're kind of listening up for people to express that a little more clearly today so we can have a takeaway and bring back to the list and see if we can have a starting point. And my sense, I said on the list, was that people had problems with each of the documents, and some people had some things to like about each of the documents as well. There was some support for other kinds of activities, maybe an IAB program or other discussion venues, but they'd seemed pretty orthogonal to the issue of going forward or not going forward with a document, that those might be separate activities, but we still want to discuss the question of whether a document should go or not. And with that, questions for authors or clarifying questions? Or agenda bashing for that matter. It's kind of loose.
Bron is in the queue.
Oh,
Bron,
sorry, I missed my queue page. Bron, go ahead.
Oh, I don't appear to be sending my video. Oh, well, can you hear me at least?
Yeah, and we got your video with a very bright,
Oh, okay.
You look rather angelic with your light over your head.
It doesn't show it to me. How weird. Two things, one of which was to say that the plus Q in chat is the way to throw questions at people, because I didn't think I heard you say that, just for people who weren't here before.
Reminder.
I have not updated my draft because everyone said they weren't going to update their draft. I'm fully aware that the security considerations section in particular needs to be resolved, but also I would like to find a consensus between all three of us for a final draft, because I think the IETF needs a consensus draft, not a special interest draft in this area. So I'd love to work on consensus with everybody. I don't think my draft is anywhere near the right place yet, but I like some of the direction of it, particularly the positive. I'm trying to put a positive spin on it. Even if your dog is bad, calling them bad dog all the time does not create a good result. Well, yes, I do look quite angelic, don't I? All right, that's all I had to say for now, but I'm quite keen to get questions from others.
Very good. And Keith, you wanted to make a comment?
Sure.
There you are.
Okay, yeah. I'm kind of the opinion that the main product should be, or the starting point for the main product should be the GitHub page. And that's really what I think we want to focus attention on. And that if we end up with a BCP or something like that, then what the subject of the BCP would be is more or less how that page gets maintained. So it would be, how do you appoint? Maybe there's a committee that edits that page. How is that committee appointed? What rules do they operate by? Maybe there's some frequency with which they're going to review that page. And also, to what extent is this page policy? So I would like to say it should be advisory only. It doesn't have a binding effect, but that would be addressed in the BCP.
So like how the registry should be used, or how the page should be used. Yeah,
something like that. And I don't have it. I haven't tried to draft text or anything, but that's kind of what over the last week that I've been thinking would be a good result. Rather than taking any of the existing internet drafts and using that as the basis for something, we could glean material from those where appropriate. But I think part of what's attractive to me about using the page is I think it really is where you want to focus the attention. And the other thing is, I think it already involves contributions from multiple people, and there may be kind of a closer to a consensus document than any of the internet drafts is. Anyway, that's just my idea.
Okay. And by the way, since not everybody has their video on all at the same time, which is a fine plan, by the way, feel free to do your head nodding in either of the chat rooms so that Francesca and I can kind of see if there is head nodding. If all you want to do is a +1, go ahead and do that. John, you are up next. Clemson.
Keith got ahead of me a little bit, but I want to sort of agree with most of what he said and take it a bit further. I think this discussion, since the initial notes were posted, has been very useful in raising awareness and opening up the issues. But I think the more we try to formalize and institutionalize this in the direction of BCPs, in the direction of formal ISG statements, in the direction of policies, I think it's clear from both the discussions and the 3 documents that the more we go in that direction, the further we dig ourselves in or dig ourselves down. And principles about what you do when you find yourself at the bottom of a hole holding a shovel are probably relevant here. So I want to repeat my argument in a little different way that I made when this discussion started, which is some guidance that these are sensitive and important issues in reviewing drafts is useful. I don't think that needs to be terribly formalized. And encouraging people at every point of the review of a document, starting from when it's first posted, to go to the authors and say, this language needs tuning from this particular standpoint of my cultural environment, whoever I happen to be, is necessary and sufficient. If a document gets to a working group last call or an IETF last call, and the authors have been told that and not gotten the message, I think it's entirely appropriate to say that more loudly. But trying to make lists of strings which don't work, and with the implication that if something doesn't work, we need to go through some procedure to add it to the list, just seems to me to be a distraction from the IETF's work and a discouragement to people who want to get that work done. Thanks.
Thanks, and feel free for any of you to jump back in. One question that Francesca and I still have is the where should work take place question. Is there work to be done for simply an AD-sponsored document to describe all this, or do we need a quick working group, or what the dispatch of this will be? Andrew, you were next in the queue.
Hi, I think I'm off mute.
You are.
Excellent. Well, firstly, responding to your request at the start, Pete, just to reiterate what I've said on the list previously, I think bronze document is the right starting document, albeit with some things needing to be added. In terms of how to move forward, firstly picking up on Keith's point, personally, I think GitHub would be the wrong place to do something for a variety of reasons, not least of which, if you want to be inclusive, maybe use something which is a lot more open than that, would be my suggestion. But then I guess many of us would have seen the publication in the last week or so of RFC 8890, which is about the internet is for users. I think there are some parallels with that potentially here, in that I think a document which sort of sets out that material published by the IETF should use inclusive language is probably all that's needed. I agree with John. You don't need to have a long list of words you shouldn't use, but actually something which is much more positive, as Bron said at the start, is rather more appropriate. So I suggest model it after RFC 8890 in that respect, and I think that was published as an IAB document, so maybe that would be the right route, but others may think differently to that.
You're still muted.
You're on mute.
I've lost track of my queue window. Sorry about that. Who was next in the queue? And thank you, Andrew.
I think we missed Bron from before.
Yeah,
And
pretty
then-
sure it was me. Hey, look, I've found my good camera. So
Ah,
I no longer look quite so beautiful, but you know, you can see me more clearly. I actually tried to put myself in the queue directly after Keith to say, yes, I agree that working on something like the GitHub resource, not necessarily GitHub, seems like the right place. That feels like something that we could all get behind. And the difficult part is how we manage it, how we manage updates, obviously. But the other question which came up there as well was the internet is for the users, 8890. Does this necessitate some kind of update to our mission? That is a bigger question, and it's kind of an elephant in the room, but I think we should address it, or at least explicitly decide not to address it at this point.
and John put himself back into the queue, I noticed. John, go ahead.
I just wanted to very briefly follow up with on one aspect of your comment, Pete, while mostly agreeing with the last two speakers. One of the options we have to have in our list of possibilities as a working group is none of the above. Or to put that differently, rather than only having the options of where we dispatch this to, there needs to be an option of saying we're done, let's move on.
Oh, yes, but what constitutes done, so obviously someone has to write down at some point, if we're going forward with GitHub or some other place for the list, someone has to write down where that is and what's going on, I think. Or are you saying, no, we can just do this as an informal, everybody agrees that this is where the list is and this is how we deal with it?
I'm saying that having spent 1.25 meetings on this and more email messages than I care to count, it is not a foregone conclusion that the output of this dispatching process needs to be more meetings and more documents and more discussion on the working list.
Okay.
I think there has to be somewhere there an option which says it was a good idea to have this discussion. Thank you. We have all the procedures in place that we need, and let's just move on.
Okay.
Simply is one of the options, even if you don't agree with it.
Right. No, and I mean, and so this is a slightly different option than reject doing anything about this. It's simply, we know where we're going. Let the ADs deal with however they want to set up whatever they need to set up.
In Jerry Salter's immemorable language, declare success and stop.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, appreciated. Victor was next in the queue. Go ahead. Victor, would you care to unmute?
Yes, I have to find my mouse so I can unmute myself. I have two screens and the mouse was in the wrong screen.
Go ahead.
Sorry about that. I have a question for Bron and Keith, and that is, if there is going to be a GitHub page, which I'm skeptical about, but you know, wait, what kind of thing are you envisioning there? Is it a list of suggested positive, this is a good idea to use for terminology for this case, or what exactly are you seeing there as the useful content of such a resource?
Gents, go right ahead and jump in.
What I see is pretty much what's there now, but with the obnoxious word problematic removed from it. Other than that, it seems like a perfectly good list of suggested alternatives. I think problematic is a loaded word that we probably don't actually need.
Keith?
Yeah, I think when I'm referring to the GitHub page, I'm talking about the page that's currently hosted on GitHub, just in case that was ambiguous. I don't think it should stay on GitHub. I just think that the text in that page is a decent starting point. And then I may have forgotten the question in the.
So the question is, are we trying to list forbidden terms specifically, or are we trying to list suggested good terminology, or are we trying to do both? Where are we going with this hypothetically?
Well, I think that page mostly tries to give advice rather than just listing terms. And I like the general advice more than I do the terms, but I don't think it hurts to have examples. And also in terms of suggested alternatives, I mean, I would want it to be very clear these are all advisory and suggestions, not any kind of sort of mandatory substitution or even forbidden words. It's more like someone said last week, use them with caution. That's close to what I have in mind. I think if you're using one of these words, maybe you should think about it. And the trick will be to making that very clear, because there will always be some people who want to insist you used a bad word. And I don't think that's very helpful, but we can try to make the page as clear as possible about that. And then just try to encourage the community to write documents with these considerations in mind. So, yeah.
And Keith, you put yourself in the queue. Did you have another comment?
I think I might have been able to. Let me think about that. Where was I going to put my head? No, I think I'm done for now, at least. So.
Okay. Next person in the queue, Bron removed himself back out of the queue. Rich, you're up.
All right. Hi. The GitHub page is good, but I'm concerned that this is the one time we publish things that aren't RFCs. And I understand it might be a compromise to get something out there, but I think we, if we're doing something, it should be as an RFC, because that's the way we work.
Okay. Barry?
Well, we do have precedent for publishing in a different format. We have the DAO document that used to be an RFC and is now maintained as a web page. So the point was that things that will change frequently, and I think this is something that will change frequently, are better off with an RFC that points to them and then having the actual data be elsewhere. Kind of think of it as an IANA registry, but not in IANA.
Keith, you wanted to make a comment?
Sure. I agree with Barry, and I also think this should not seem as formal as an RFC, even though some of our RFCs are not terribly formal. I don't want to make it seem like it's a standard. Honestly, I think it's advice, and we do have advice on other web pages. So also, I think frequency of update, what I have in mind is currently once a year. So you shouldn't have to have these discussions constantly, that maybe once a year people review suggestions and modify that web page accordingly. Could be every 6 months. It could start out 6 months intervals and go to once a year. I don't know, but I think certainly less frequently than we want to update an RFC.
Bron?
Interestingly enough, I agree almost entirely with Rich here, though I do take Keith's point about the update frequency. I don't think it will update that frequently after maybe the first couple. It might cycle quite fast to start off with, and then I think it will change quite slowly. It has to change quite slowly. The whole point is that we're choosing conservative terms that will last us a long time. They're supposed to go in documents that will last 20, 30 years. If we're trying to update this thing every month, we're doing it wrong. I think there's an impression, for whatever reason, that making an RFC is particularly high cost. I don't think it should be to do one per year on top of all the other RFCs that we do. I don't think that's any higher cost than setting up a brand new process. The question of whether it's going to be trusted as an RFC and hence considered a standard, I don't think it makes much difference. I think people will refer to it regardless and try and use the weight of the IETF as a baton to whack other people over the head with, you should do this. I don't think the way we publish it will make any difference. If it's from a website that says IETF on it, it'll be treated the same. So I don't think it makes any difference. I'm in favor of publishing it through our standard publishing stream and standing by it, whatever we publish, not putting it on a website that can be updated arbitrarily.
Interesting. Okay. Victor?
Hi, I'm faster with the mouse this time. So two things. One is, I guess, the whole context in which we're working here is the context of language shifts and language changes, and things, you know, that were okay yesterday might not be okay today, and vice versa. So I'm skeptical of the stability of an RFC. I also fear that an RFC lends the negative connotations of deviating from the standard too much weight. These, as Keith and others have pointed out, should be aids to authors to, you know, stay out of trouble where they might accidentally not be aware of something. These are not taboos. There isn't, frankly, a major problem in IETF in this space. I'm surprised at how much time we're spending on this. The evidence that we're, you know, rife with language problems is rather thin. Sure, we can make some positive statements to encourage people, but I think an RFC suggests that we indeed strongly believe that we have a deep and, you know, problem that requires serious attention, where what we have is potentially just some lack of guidance in some cases, and guidance as such need not be quite so heavyweight.
Okay, Rich? Rich, who's looking for...
Yep, there we go. Sorry. To the point mentioned before, you know, the DAO used to be a RFC and now isn't. It's also not a thing that talks about how we do our standards. We have RFCs on security considerations, privacy considerations. HRPC is trying to do something on human considerations. The internet is for the users is also one. So again, I don't think the analogies that, oh, we have other documents holds. I am concerned. I understand, oh, we're mostly on the right path. Let's slow this down. Okay, I'm rambling, but I think it should be an RFC because that's how we publish things. And we say in other forums, we can't control how people use them. We're not the protocol police. If someone, you know, we're following industry trends here. We're not leading them. No one's going to use our list of words, which is culled from what other people do as a way to beat people over the head.
And Braun?
Yep, just replying to Victor's point there, I think the answer to that is to make sure that the draft uses very positive language and very encouraging and may rather than must and should about the substitutions. And at that point, it's no different than other documents. And back to, as I said before, I think it doesn't make a difference where we publish it. I have already seen the draft that exists already being used in other places on the internet as say, hey, look, the IETF already says this. Things with draft in their name are treated just as real as RFCs by the rest of the world. It says IETF in the URL, that is enough. I don't actually think it makes much difference to how people will see it. So I think this is a It's a legitimate concern, but I don't think it's a significant risk. I don't think it's going to make any difference how we publish it, but I think using the RFC publication thing, amongst other things, means we always know it. It's not something that will be changed under us. I think using archive.org to see what the IETF said last week is nowhere near as good as the immutable record. I like immutable records.
So I've seen a couple of people, and Andrew +1 to RFC along the lines of 8890. So am I hearing, for those who think having some sort of RFC would be good, that you think an RFC stating what this is about is what we want, and then the list of possible terminology would be somewhere independent, or you're thinking we want to build this list and solidify it in the RFC? I wasn't clear on those who like the idea of an RFC, what they were looking for. Anyone want to pipe up? John, go ahead. I see the queue is building now. Thank you. John, you were first up.
Yeah, I'm, again, and partly what I'm about to say depends on the answer to the question you just asked. But I fear that if we move toward codifying a list of terminology in an RFC or anything like that, that we are going to be exposing the IETF's ignorance and insensitivity to the cultures and vocabulary we haven't picked up. And that's particularly important because I have now seen in this discussion, and curiously enough, a discussion in another context which is closely paralleling it, although not at quite as high a volume, terms used that are themselves offensive and discriminatory and demeaning, used to discuss whether or not people should be using or not using a different set of offensive and demeaning terms, but based upon different cultural assumptions and with sensitivities based on one's selection of one's grandparents. And I just really think it would be unfortunate for the IETF to go down this path. And that's particularly important because every single term or set of words that show up on in somebody's discussions or terminology or documents, if we codify and solidify this as official IETF policy, is going to turn out to be the source, either the source of yet another debate of the likes we've been having for the last couple of months, or dismissive behavior towards somebody's position that something or other is offensive. And I'm trying to figure out how to navigate this in a way which keeps the IETF focused on surprise, its technical work and its contributions to the internet community, rather than getting dragged down into this discussion, no matter how important the terminology is and the sensitivity of that terminology is, which I completely agree that it's important. I just am trying very hard to figure out a way to navigate this that doesn't drag us down.
So can I read that answer? If you were to answer my question directly, it would be, if there's going to be an RFC, it certainly shouldn't have a list of terms in it.
If there's going to be an RFC, we should talk about broad principles and the importance of sensitivity on these issues, and if necessary, ways of raising observations about particular documents which overlap with these issues, but absolutely should not contain vocabulary.
Okay, that's what I was looking for.
Much less a mapping vocabulary, which goes beyond this is bad, use that.
Right. Okay, Andrew, you had a comment on it.
Yeah, which is just to say, without harping on too much about RFC 8890, but forgive me, that is published as informational, and I think that's what's needed here, is something which is informational. And other than that, I pretty much agree with what John just said. To focus on principles would be particularly helpful. Because I guess the risk of publishing a list of forbidden words, for example, is twofold. A, it will be out of date. And B, depending on your cultural references, it will either look entirely reasonable or completely ridiculous, and neither of those is especially helpful. So I think principles is better, and an informational RFC would seem like the right place to approach this from.
Yeah, and Miria reminds us in the Jabber chat that one of the reasons that 8890 is informational is because it came out of the IAB and therefore couldn't be a BCP even if it wanted to be.
Maybe that's a useful route to follow, though, to put it out as an IAB document. Can you dispatch to the IAB?
In theory, we could, but they could choose to tell us no.
So I just wanted to,
yeah,
sorry for interrupting, but yeah, I'm interested to hear from John and whoever spoke before, if you have ideas on where the content of this RFC would be discussed, which is where should we dispatch this discussion?
Yep, that's our eventual what needs to come out of this working group. Bron, you were after Andrew.
Oh, I am back again. Yeah, so I think John raised the one big problem with enumerating a list, which is that you can't enumerate a complete list, and that putting anything in the list prioritizes those particular words above any other word. That is a hard problem, and certainly the easiest way to solve it is not to have a list at all. The problem with not having a list at all is then you have very little. So the question is whether the principles along with the GitHub link are sufficient and will make people happy. I would certainly be satisfied with that, because I likewise agree that we don't have a giant problem, and I think we could create a giant problem for ourselves by trying to solve a small problem. But I know other people have different opinions about both the level of the problem and the value of any particular signal, really. It comes down to whether we're signaling to the world that we care about them. And a way to do that doesn't signal to other large sections of the world that we don't care about them is the tricky problem here.
Fair enough. Keith?
Yeah, I was just thinking a minute ago that really the immediate near-term thing that we need to decide is, how does this document get maintained? How does this, what I'm calling the GitHub document now, even though it would probably be hosted somewhere else, and that's the thing. I think what a lot of us want is for this stuff not to be critical path for other IETF work or for GenDispatch, right? We want to move this somewhere where it will be taken care of and given the appropriate amount of attention, which is to say not too much, but enough, so that people who have concerns about particular language that IETF is or might be using can send their comments there, and that some team of people will look at this and periodically make recommendations that are non-binding. But there would be a place to do that. If IEB wants to do that, that might be a good place. Or if we wanted to create a separate group for doing that, that might also work. But at some point, we kind of need a proposal for how to do it. And so the next task might really be edit a proposal for how this gets maintained. And one thing that GenDispatch might decide to do is say, we'll entertain proposals on the mailing list for how to maintain this kind of thing. And then that will get dispatched later. So I'm really kind of saying, how do we move this away so that it's not critical path? That's really kind of how I'm thinking about it.
And I'm trying to get my head around that, mostly because the only good agenda item for GenDispatch is one that is gone. So
well, but the thing is, right now we don't even have a proposal for that. So I don't know what to do in the absence of a proposal. Do you form a design team? But I don't see that as one of GenDispatch's options.
A plausible answer to your question is GenDispatch could say to Alyssa, look, form yourself a mailing list and have a quick BOF at one or another IETF meetings and, you know, assign appropriate people to get an RFC on the principles written and a way that you're going to manage this on that list over there that goes with the BOF that you set up, and be done with it.
Well, I would say please don't do that, because I really think this needs to come from the bottom up and not from the top down.
Right. Well, someone's got to set up the where it's going to take place. You know, independent of whether there's, you know, what happens in that place. And ADs are meant to go off and create mailing lists and or put a BOF on an agenda and let people discuss.
Well, would GenDispatch want to make recommendations about that, or is that going too far?
That's exactly in our purview of what exactly we want the area director in this particular case to do. We can say, we think you should do these things. That's what dispatch is about. So,
okay. All right.
Yeah. John, you cued yourself. John?
Yeah,
There you go.
I was going to try to just put this in Jabber, and then the last comment or so inspired me, and it's probably not the right term. The first answer is where to dispatch. As I've suggested earlier, I think our best alternative is dispatch this to nowhere. No lists in GitHub, the IETF web pages, Bitbucket, or elsewhere. No committee needed to prepare that non-existent list. No task. There's no discussion about where to discuss it. If that doesn't work for us, and there has to be mailing list discussion, the other side of the inclusiveness that motivated this whole argument suggests that needs to be the IETF list. And if the IETF list isn't inclusive enough, and John Levine's recent posting suggests that it is not, then we have a much more serious problem than what to do about this terminology.
So you would rather just have it be, if there has to be further discussion, you would rather just have it be further IETF list discussion to get this focused and end of story.
If there has to be further discussion, I would rather have the discussion on a document by document basis in context until the culture adjusts itself as necessary to better use of terminology and avoidance of offensive terminology. And has been pointed out earlier, I do not believe we have, like the earlier comment, I think, Bronze, we don't have a major problem here. There's no evidence that we really have a major problem here. And if this is a relatively infrequent problem which crops up occasionally, then I think we ought to be doing this on a informal correction basis and on a private comments to author basis, unless there's rejection of the author, very much to the point of how we handle things which some individual doesn't think are offensive and bullying, but other people might, especially those being offended or bullied.
Okay. Andrew.
Yeah, as I put on Jabber, I think the problem with posting it nowhere, so dispatching it nowhere rather, even though I agree with John and Bron and others, I don't think this is a huge problem. I think the issue with doing nothing about it is that in itself sends a message which would be unhelpful. So given the sheer
John, you're still unmuted.
So given the sheer volume of discussion on the IETF mailing list from a few weeks back, just dropping it, I think, would be the wrong approach. And for the same reason, I think putting it back to the IETF mailing list would also be distinctly unhelpful, given that the discussion on the IETF mailing list degenerated into an unproductive discussion previously. So I just question why we think putting it back there would be a useful next step, which is why I think an informational RFC, so doing something to try and kill the problem is better than doing nothing. to kill the problem in this instance. I think some activity is required this time round.
All right, Rich, you were next.
Yeah, I agree with Andrew that if we take it back to the IETF list, not only will it be a big unproductive discussion, but we also saw that attempts to quell and make the discussion more productive ended up calling into question some of the motives of the leadership and really stormed out of control. The second thing is I want to respond to what one of the things John said. Asking that those who are offended or harmed take on the responsibility, that's not a good thing, and it tends to not work well, or tends to work really badly when you have marginalized communities or victims. I don't think we're anywhere near that stage, of course, but it's not a good way. Well, if you're offended, speak up. That's like saying, well, if you're being abused, speak up. It tends to be, experience has shown us that it's hard. And again, I'm not saying this direct parallel or that we're anywhere near close to that by probably orders of magnitude. That's all.
Okay, thanks. Bron?
Got lots of notes here this time. Yeah, I think it would not be productive on the IETF list. I think the work needs to be done by people who are willing to show up and do the work, not just drive by and comment on it. So another list, but advertised widely and clearly, I think has a lot of value. Saying that those who are offended by something, we don't want to have to force them to take on the work, sure. The flip side is that we have to be sure that they otherwise would take on the work in the IETF and add value. Otherwise, we have basically we're chasing at shadows, as I think Keith just commented on there, having people who are proxying for those who are supposedly offended, coming in and using that as a way to force their views, because they can say the lurkers in email are complaining to me and supporting me and feel marginalized. I think that is a failure mode that we can't really allow to happen. The most important thing here, and I'm seeing the comment of we want it to be as minimal as possible. We do want to send a welcome signal to people. We have, I mean, you look at the makeup of the IETF and you could say it's systemically racist, you could say it's systemically Western, you could say it's systemically English, you could say it's systemically American to a large degree. It's largely people from the USA. There are lots of ways in which we don't represent the entire world. I think representing the entire world is not our primary goal. Our primary goal is to produce high quality documents that improve the internet. And to the extent that that is done by the people who show up, we want people who will do that to show up, and we want them to feel welcome when they arrive. And so our goal needs to be something that welcomes those who have an interest in that and are willing to do the work. And so having a group that is there for those who want to get there is hopefully not filled by hobbyists who care about this but don't care about the IETF's work. That is a danger mode that I think is tricky. How much do we want people who want to play around in the sandpit of which words are good and bad, but don't have any value to add to the internet?
John, you put yourself back in earlier, but you did say something in the chat. Have something additional?
Yeah, I put myself in the queue before, and I want to pick up on something that Bron said. I'm very concerned about any ongoing discussions we have about this turning into an activity for hobbyists, to use his term, who then dictate to the people trying to do technical work how they should do that technical work. That has intermittently but long-term been a problem in the IETF. I'm concerned about encouraging it, and I'm concerned, as I think I said in the chat, about getting into a situation where people have to choose between being part of this conversation and doing technical work, or any other kind of work which improves the internet rather than the IETF style. The reason I'm advocating doing this on a document by document basis is that I think our most frequent problem is going to come up in practice when we are doing a revision or update or clarification or BCP about an existing document which uses old terminology. And at that point, the new document is going to have a discussion about whether new terminology, which confuses people because it's different, is better than retaining the old terminology, which is offensive. And I don't see how to have that conversation except on a per document basis. If we have a completely de novo document, which has no previous precedent, in no previous track history, and we don't have that very often in my recent experience, then it is appropriate to question terminology in those documents. And if the people who are most offended have whatever it takes, good, bad, or indifferent, or obnoxiousness, to raise those issues, fine. If somebody else has to raise them on their behalf, fine. If they can be raised privately with authors, that's less problematic than having to raise a public stink. But I don't see how to do this on a basis of a word list without having that document by document discussion. And if we're going to have document by document discussion, let's have the document by document discussion rather than trying to create word lists, and more importantly, special discussion groups and committees who are going to become the language police for everybody else.
Yeah. Victor, you're up.
Just wanted to mention, and perhaps you're aware, that the idea that people who find material, in the ongoing IETF workflow objectionable will stay silent, I think, lacks some credibility. You may have seen a note from me that I found something objectionable. I sent to you, didn't want to make a big stink about it on the list, but, I found something objectionable and I wrote about it. And if somebody's so shy, they can probably find somebody to speak for them. But the idea that we will stay entirely unaware of objectionable material, especially in the current climate, seems not terribly credible. I think the feedback will come forward one way or another.
Well, let me point out that others have said that if the feedback comes from other than those who were offended, that is somehow not credible, which is sort of a cycling process.
There's a different kind of other, right? Sometimes it is a person who was too uncomfortable, but a specific one, and spoke directly to me, and it's firsthand. Whereas what we're seeing sometimes is that there's a hypothetical class of people on whose behalf you're speaking, and then the credibility does go down. Yes, when we're speaking for a generic, hypothetical, imagined offended person, even if the imagination is on the money, credibility disappears once it's kind of vacuous. But indeed, some people might be so shy that they want to not engage for fear of whatever directly. That's fine. If they find a proxy that's direct, no problem. The credibility is fine if there's a proxy.
Andrew.
Yeah, just this discussion reminded me that if you cast your minds back to the lengthy dialogue on the IETF list, I do remember reading one memorable post by someone that said, I think they were an academic, I can't remember who it was, otherwise I'd say, but that they'd received a document from some people from an excluded group that used terminology that they thought should have offended those people, but clearly didn't because they used the terminology, and they felt they'd done a good job by explaining to them why they should have been offended. And I struggle with that because clearly they weren't offended, so you're then trying to transfer your feelings about terminology to other people. So I think that sort of thing is quite problematic, as opposed to I think the last comment, which was if you've had a first-hand feedback from someone who, for whatever reason, feels unable to represent themselves but is personally offended, that's different. But representing that specific groups of people clearly are offended but without any first-hand experience, I think it is just a nonsense, and that's just a way of trying to just an opinion on something rather than explaining it coherently for yourself.
Rich, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up something that was mentioned in the unofficial chat here. We're trying, overall, we're trying to be more inclusive and to say, oh, well, if someone's offended, let them, and they make that known, then we will make every effort, we'll bend over backwards, what have you, to accommodate them. But the concern, and I raised this at the previous meeting, the concern is not that, is that the people aren't even here at the table. If you look around the room here, most of us are not of, are, to be frank, privileged middle-aged white guys from, whatever country. And so by not coming forward and not saying, yes, we are going to try to be inclusive, and here are some of the ways we are doing that. And I have come around to, going to say, okay, we don't have to have a prescriptive list per se, but we should say, it's kind of funny that we seem to be emerging consensus around the IESG 3-sentence statement that started this whole thing. But the people who might be hurt or might be driven off or might say, oh, this just reinforces, what was a recent article? White hair, old men in a room talking loudly. They're never going to be here. So I disagree with the fact that we'll get feedback. What will, based on my personal experiences on the IETF list and open source projects, we'll get feedback, but it won't be that kind. It will be from people who say, no, everything is fine. And that's putting it mildly.
Robert, you wanted to jump in here.
Hi. So just a quick question, actually, back to John, I guess, on having a word list. So on some of the discussion, there's been comments about a word list is bad. But I, as a reviewer, think that it's quite helpful to have a list of words of things that aren't banned, but potentially words you might want to be aware of and sensitive to. So not as a way of trying to restrict the words people are using, but for example, the term grandfathered that appears on that list, I was never aware that it had any cultural sensitivity at all. Whereas now, having seen that, I would potentially think in a document, well, maybe I won't use that term, I could use a different term instead. So I feel that having a list of words just to warn people or advise people that maybe you might want to not use these terms, and maybe a short description as to why, I feel that that's potentially a beneficial thing. I do see there's a concern that that could turn into people trying to beat the stick saying you must not use these terms. So I think you'd need some sensitivity as to how it is described. But generally, the industry seems to be moving in this direction where we try and have more sensitivity to the language. And I think that the IETF should be sensitive to that industry trend and somewhat say, yes, we're aware of that and we want to be good citizens.
Thanks. Bron?
I was mostly replying to Rich about the middle-aged white men shouting loudly in rooms. Interestingly, the couple of people who pushed back most strongly against the language stuff on the list were people who were not from your Western European or US Western college liberal elite educated people. So we had a Japanese person who was quite strongly against this and was quite definitely shouted down as, no, you're being culturally insensitive here. Like this is the one major culture that was represented in that discussion other than Western university educated snobs, if we wanted to put it that way. And so who are we excluding here? Are we looking for people who look just like us but have darker skin? Because that seems to be a lot of what I'm seeing in this, is we're looking for people who are just like us and think just like us, but look a little different. And I don't think that's the primary inclusive goal that would actually give us different thoughts and different ideas.
Victor?
Just briefly, I did want to maybe give John a chance to answer Bron first. So if you wanted to put me behind him, I'll wait. or was it Bron or somebody asked John the question directly, and I thought maybe it'd be better remembered if it were answered now.
Did you want to make a comment, John, or?
I sort of did in the chat.
No, that's fine.
I think we need to open up the private channels for this, and they need to work. And that's one specific constructive suggestion. Having started talking again, two observations. One about Colin's comment, which is that I recognize that and appreciate it, but again, following up on Bron's comment, we better make certain that if we're doing that, we are not deciding that this problem is all about people whose skin is slightly darker or whose educational background is slightly different than the collection of people on this call. And the comment that when somebody came in from a different cultural environment, he was immediately shouted down is precisely one of the reasons I'm worried about trying to do this by list or by committee. And I don't know how to balance those things. And following up Bron's comment with one that will probably not be clear to most of the people on this list, and that's deliberate. In addition to people with darker skins, one could also be talking about people with bigger noses. And if you don't understand the reference, that makes my point.
And I believe you meant Robert, not Colin, but that's okay. Just in case Francesca missed it for the notes.
Yeah, sorry, I get confused easily at my age.
Victor.
Yes, I do want to respond to the question of people not in the room, and I agree that there are lots of people not participating in the IETF who are not representative of the world. But I very much want to counter the view that the reason they're not here is because of potential terminology or other issues, as opposed to the fact that participation in the IETF is a luxury activity. It is costly in time and often costly in terms of employer support. You need to work at a company that's rich enough to fund you there if you're going to be attending regularly, or if you're a bit of a hobbyist like me, then you need to have sufficient independent income to be able to take the time and energy to do this rather than put bread on the table.
A question for you, Victor. I mean, speaking of firsthand experience, I've certainly had firsthand conversations with women who don't participate simply because of the environment, not because they do not have the funding, not because they somehow are technically less able, but they simply don't because they feel that the environment is not sufficiently inclusive that they can be heard.
But there, I think the structural problem that makes it so is, again, not terminology, but the fact that this is a competitive rough and tumble place, and that the employers who send people to push their view of the standards and technologies through expect them to play politics.
No, I'm hearing from women specifically that women will not participate, not because it's rough and tumble, but because women are directly targeted for being women.
Okay, and that may be the case, but again, the language in these drafts,
language is clearly part of it.
No, but the language in these drafts, right?
Yeah, isn't
that language, right?
No, there's language that is clearly part of language being used in documents that's clearly part of that.
Right, but sexism and pickup attempts and harassing and so on, which happens in any industry, happens in this one, happens when it's all just men and there are a few women, that's life, isn't about master slave, blacklist, whitelist, none of that.
It sounds like you're speaking without experience of talking to these people. That's what it sounds like to me.
Okay,
I'm going through this exercise.
Yeah,
I'm
I
going
agree
through this,
with you.
Victor. I'm going through this exercise simply because I want to make sure that we are not committing the same offense that was talked about before, which is saying things without experience of talking to people who may have been affected by this.
Right. Agreed, there are those other issues, but again, the list of suggested terminologies, right, in this particular dispatch, none of that addresses harassment of women, right?
But it certainly affects what might be exclusionary to other people. And I just want to make sure that people.
Okay, it's a bit of a stretch.
Please let me finish.
All right.
I want to make sure that people don't go down the path of saying that certain things do not exist because they've had no experience of them. Okay.
Yep.
Because I think we agree that that's part of the problem here is people saying things without firsthand experience of what's gone on.
Right. And you know, on the making it a more hospitable place for women, I'd be all over supporting that, to be honest, as opposed to technical terms. You know, really, you know, I think that's a big difference. It is a credible and real issue, and probably one we can document as being a significant issue for the IETF, where previously I said these issues are not a significant problem in my view. The women issue has a real, you know, feel to it that resonates.
All right, Rich, you were in the queue.
Yeah, I just, to clarify, because I think Victor was responding to the comment I made, I wasn't saying that when I said the people who might be offended aren't in the room, I wasn't saying that's not why they're there here with us. I wasn't commenting at all on reasons why someone may or may not participate. I was just saying that looking at our membership, it seems pretty obvious that the people we think are partially driven away, one of the possible reasons, I think there's enough weasel words there, are the language and confrontation style. And keep it focused, the language. And also, to repeat what I said previous meeting, the industry is moving this way. And if you look at that GitHub page, every single term that's called out there is endorsed as being, I'll say, problematic by multiple organizations. And we have to assume that some of them know what they're doing. That's all. Thanks.
Andrew.
Sorry, just coming off mute. Yeah, just picking up on that last conversation. You can see I posted in the Jabber. I mean, maybe the RFC could usefully look beyond just terminology to inclusiveness more broadly, because the IETF is not a particularly diverse organisation, but in fairness, neither is the tech sector. So I suspect, and I've not got stats on this, but I suspect it's no worse than the sector itself. But having said that, it does lack diversity of thought as an organisation overall. I don't think that's a problem to do with terminology, to be perfectly honest. I think that's a problem more to do with culture. And maybe that's where a slightly wider sort of focused or more broadly framed informational RFC on inclusiveness would be useful, just to sort of give some broad principles as to to be clear that the IETF does or would welcome more diverse participation by different groups. And then just very briefly on the list of forbidden words to be avoided, whatever. I just remember, I think I said this on the last call, there were some posts from people in Eastern Europe who'd had prior experience of forbidden words and the use of those having consequences, and they were very concerned about that direction of travel. So I think that just needs to be approached with care, maybe learning from people that have had first-hand experience of that previously. And focusing more on positiveness. So going back to where we started, where Bron and others suggested not focusing on the negatives, focusing on the positives would be a more productive way forward. That was it.
Thanks. Bron, you were next up.
Woohoo. I also want to bring it back maybe to a discussion of where we're going to go from here, because it does feel like we're going around in circles. One question that comes out of all of this is, what are our success criteria for this work? How do we know it's succeeded? How do we tell that we're going in the right direction? I think we have the previous meeting. We don't have either of the authors of one of the drafts here, which is difficult because one of their main objections to my draft was that it didn't cite references and it wasn't pointing to scholarly research in the area. I have notes to address that. The turtles all the way down problem, which I think is part of the problem also with the list that's in GitHub. Yes, all these organizations are saying these words are problematic, and to a certain extent they're all cross-referencing each other and cross-referencing the same research, and to some extent also having the same groups pushing into each of these organizations that these words are problematic and then mirroring it back out. And that was certainly one of the concerns that was raised in the mailing list, was the potential for the IETF to be used to amplify that same message that is being pushed in. Obviously, also the issue with any scholarly work is that you need to tell what the quality of it is, whether it's reproducible, whether it suffers from publication bias, where even if you can reproduce some things, or even if the methodology was sound, whether there were 10 different surveys done and one of them found this issue and that's the one that's published, which is a particular issue in medical areas. I don't think we want to try to base ourselves on references, because I think that opens up a giant can of worms where you're then relying on the quality of those references. I would prefer us to do it from sound principles, and from the principle of our goals are still to produce high quality technical documents for the internet. If we became a super inclusive organization that had millions of different views and an equal representation of all colors, flavors, and preservatives of people, I don't think that would be valuable if we no longer produce high quality technical documents. So we need to have our eye on the goal of producing high quality technical documents, and the reason for including additional people and for more diversity of thought and diversity of people in the organization is to do better at our goals, not the primary goal being increasing diversity along any particular axis.
So I appreciate that, and I think my colloquy with Victor probably moved us further away from the goal of this discussion, and I apologize for that, which is, you know, what are we going to do, whether we count this as a wildly important immediate solve issue or a minor thing that would be good to do anyway that will increase our ability to write good, solid technical documents. What is the outcome that we want? And I think, Bron, you've done a good job of pointing us in that direction.
Yeah, if I could spell out, I think where I'm at in terms of the outcome I think we should go for here. I think publishing a document, basically a welcoming document, informational RFC, saying we want to use inclusive language, we want to use good terms, and the reason we want to do it is that we want a variety of inputs. We want to bring people from all over the world with all different backgrounds who are interested in producing high quality technical documents to further the internet. We want our environment to be welcoming, all these good things, and a place where discussion of specific terms that are causing specific issues or specific things can happen. There's not the all IETF list, but is some long-running place, because I don't think this is a problem we're going to solve now. I think we need a place for discussion to happen. I think it needs rules. I think it needs to be built in a way that doesn't devolve into special interests fighting at each other. I don't know how to do that. If I had an answer to that, I'd be rich. But I think that's not you rich, actual with money. Yeah, I think we need a document, and I would love it to be a consensus document. I'd love it to be based on principles, not on references, as I said earlier. But I think we should be able to build that kind of thing and publish it as a welcoming thing. I'm less inclined to put the list of words in it than I was earlier in this meeting because of the incompleteness problem. As soon as you bless a particular list of words, you no longer, anything that's not on that list is considered to be of less value. And I think that's exclusionary in and of itself. But I think having a place where we accumulate the things we know about is a good idea, because we do need some kind of place where this is discussed. If you do nothing, then if you go so wishy-washy that you don't record anything, then that is a statement of doing nothing at all. I think I'm rambling now.
No worries.
Chat. Yes, go ahead, Pete.
Yeah, and the reminder that if you do have access to Jabber, it is easier for us to track the chat over in Jabber than it is in the WebEx chat, but it's fine. We'll copy and paste before we close the meeting down, but do bring it over to Jabber if you can. Was there something else, Francesca?
I just want to ask if there is anybody that has objection to Bron's proposal to try to build on, yeah.
Right, like a principles document. I see Robert in the queue, but I like putting that question out, and then we'll to Robert in a moment. Are there strong objections to doing sort of principles RFC, whatever status it might have, but a principles RFC and possible look-aside list of suggested useful terminology? That's interesting.
No, it's failure to find the unmute button and not knowing how you wanted your responses.
Oh, feel free to unmute yourself and jump in if you have objections to such a plan.
I think such a document would be a good idea, probably, but my probably is based on not understanding whether that document is expected to reflect IETF consensus, the clear opinion of an individual or two, which means that the current rules that cannot be published in the IETF stream, or something else.
I think if we recommend something, if we dispatch, whoops, sorry, go ahead.
If we recommend that dispatch something that has to turn into an IETF consensus document, then I see it as potentially taking us down another rat hole of discussions that distract from doing the IETF's technical work. Important though it may be.
So I'll take that as possible, but you find it not likely that we're going to get out of the rat trap if we try and do that.
You should take that as favoring the idea in principle, but having grave concerns about how we get from here to there, which
okay,
the same thing you just said.
All right, Pete,
go ahead.
Yeah, you may be surprised that I would in fact support the principles document, especially if it leaves the specific list of terminology entirely out. Because then all the arguments about which words are good and which words are bad and which ones are loaded in which culture evaporate entirely. And we're talking about communicating clearly and sensitively and listening to people and all kinds of good things behind which I think we can all stand with no real controversy. I'm not here to be a dogmatic bigot. I'm here to be able to express myself clearly and not feel like there's a language police standing behind my back.
Interesting. And let me follow up, and others can jump in with this as well. And I haven't forgotten about you, Robert. But if Victor and one of the others, do you object to having a list of words with discussion about why they might or may not be useful or possible alternatives to those words? Or is the list, right out? You don't want to have any such list?
So I don't see any possibility of consensus on such a list.
Right.
Although if the list sticks entirely to positive, here are good terms for these cases, and
Right.
stays well away from here are culturally loaded reasons why the previous ones are bad, we may be able to converge on some subset of the things about these are good terms.
Okay, that's interesting. So let me get back to Robert, and then I saw Keith put himself in the queue later on. So Robert, did you want to make a comment?
Yes, I mean, actually, in terms of Ron's suggestion, I'm very supportive of what he's suggesting there on many fronts. I think that having a positive document is definitely the way forward. I feel that definitely not putting a curated list of words in a document is a good idea. I think that would be a mistake. It would have lots of arguments, and also what's clear is this terminology and what words are good and bad changes over time. So we need a mechanism that if you have such a list of words, that it can evolve over time in a reasonable way. So again, I think that having a document that says this is what we're aiming for and this is what we're encouraging, I think that's a good thing. I do actually still believe that having a list of words is useful outside of that, like the GitHub with the references. I actually like that. I think it's good. I personally would say I would regard, not saying that words are problematic, I would say the words are potentially problematic. So I don't want to say you should not use these terms, but maybe you should think about using these other terms. They might be better choices. They might be less loaded, less culturally sensitive. So not telling people off, these are bad, but these are potentially better choices. So again, trying to frame that in a positive light, I think is a good thing. And one of the other points that Ron made about do we need to include references as to why we're doing this? Again, I agree with Ron here that that's not necessary in my mind. I don't think we need to say, oh, these are cases where people have got this wrong and hence we need to fix this. I think, again, having the document purely focused on what we're trying to achieve and why we're trying to achieve it is sufficient. I don't think there's any need to pull out particular cases or particular expressions. I think that there's enough understanding in the industry about what those things are anyway that writing them down is not helpful.
Keith, you put yourself in the queue.
Yeah, so trying to sum up, I like Ron's proposal. I especially like the idea of making it welcoming. I believe that any sort of specific discussion of words or terminology belongs in a separate place. I do think we probably need that. I'm guessing that there's going to be we don't have any of the real strong objectors on this call, but I suspect we'll get some pretty strong pushback if there's not a place to put examples of terminology. And I might like it if I were wrong, but that's my guess. And as for the outcome of this meeting, I'm wondering if the right answer is create a mailing list so that the discussion goes somewhere. It's not in GenDispatch, it's not on the IETF list. But again, we don't have a proposal at the moment to say, let's make this an RFC. And I don't exactly want that to come down from on high. I'd rather that come from the bottom up. So that's kind of my concrete suggestion for the outcome of this meeting.
So, and to frame that, one question that I was asked sort of, separately, and I think it's a reasonable one, is if we do propose that there's going to be a document, and let's say it's going to be AD sponsored, well, who gets to choose who's the editor and what that document's going to look like? And would it not be easier if we just did one of the art area style quick spin up working group, so that they can choose a document editor, write the document, and then hand it off and be done?
Well,
So you say, let's have a little mailing list and be bottom up about it. But I want to know what form that takes so that when we make our dispatch recommendation, I have an idea about what I'm suggesting is going to happen.
I think about creating a working group is that there is a presumption that the group is going to publish output. And that might be a little bit unconstructive. And I think that maybe often when a working group is created, there's sort of some direction given to the working group that says, you're going to use this document as a starting point. And so how do you get to that starting point? How do you get that document? And does the IESG or the chair pick a document and say that shall be the starting point, or do you sort of entertain suggestions? I mean, there's problems with both approaches. I don't know. I feel like we need some concrete output of this meeting so that we don't loop forever. That's where I'm coming from.
Rich, you wanted to jump back in.
Yeah, I can certainly support a document. I think, as we've been talking about, I think having good examples, just the column B as opposed to the column A is important to get people thinking along the right terms, and it doesn't do anything disparaging. We say, well, if you have a collection of servers and one of them is in charge of the other, or whatever the words are, use these terms. I think we need to have examples, and I think it's not by saying, oh, we're not going to use the word master slave, but we're going to say, well, in this kind of situation, use this terminology. In this kind of situation, use those terminology. This is not an exhaustive list. I'm much less worried. I guess I can use the 25-cent word sanguine. I'm much more sanguine about if something new comes along, how we update the RFC. We have a whole errata system. We can decide to publish a document that says, here's some more examples, or we can issue a whole new RFC, once we get enough word changes. I think worrying that the list will evolve over time, we've handled that all the time. So this is not something special. Thank you.
All right. I don't see anyone else in the queue. Interesting.
So Victor mentioned in the WebEx chat, isn't Bron's document looking like a plausible consensus starting point? So what we noticed during last interim was that Bron's document was indeed the one with the most support.
Interesting. So let's put that question to this group of people. I mean, this is obviously, we're going to bring it back to the list and get a little input. And, I don't know if Bron wants to sign up to be the continuing editor of this, but are people in this room inclined to take Bron's document as sort of the input document to something AD sponsored as a principles document and carve it down into something that has consensus? And I will take John's giggling as if we think that can happen. And are there folks who don't think that's a good idea, or think that we should start somewhere else?
You said AD sponsored. That means not a working group.
That means not a work. Right. I mean, the sound I heard from the last few comments was, especially Keith, but others, on a working group maybe, so that we would maybe set up a mailing list to how to get Bron's document into this principles document we're talking about, and then it would be AD sponsored, because that's if we want it to be an IETF document, that's our only choice other than a working group.
All right. So just since I opened this question, I don't have much experience with the IETF process. I've really been focused a lot more in a few narrow technical areas. So I can't really comment on what's a working group and what's an AD sponsored document. Then neither of them sounds particularly objectionable so long as it produces the kind of document under discussion.
Okay. Appreciate it.
For me, fine, whatever.
Anybody want to raise? Yeah, Rich, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a clarifying question. Concern was raised about, oh, a working group is designed to produce output, therefore a working group isn't appropriate. But I thought if we're going an AD route, it would be to produce a document. So could you explain that difference?
Yeah, well, and maybe Keith can talk to it better, but my interpretation is that working groups, because they have the formality that they do, go in with an assumption that they are going to output some document, and whether or not the working group actually it comes to a clean consensus, there is a push to get the document out, whereas AD sponsored might not have that kind of bias. Did I capture that correctly, Keith? Who might want to unmute?
Good enough.
Yeah. So I don't think there's
Okay,
a difference in actual form of what we're talking about, but that, you know, if we set up a mailing list, discuss this for a bit, it wouldn't be as, you know, heavily managed as a working group, because there wouldn't be an assigned chair. Turn this into some sort of principles document, and basically 4-week, you know, last call it and say, if you have any objections to this set of principles, speak now or forever hold your peace. Where a working group would have a chair running the discussion and might have some bias to produce something, even if the working group really is saying, no, nothing should be produced here.
I just wanted to answer the question of would I be willing to do this. I threw my hat into the ring by writing this thing in the first place.
Okay.
I think I'm committed to this. I'm happy to do it. I do not want to be the only author on it. I would love to have other authors from a variety of viewpoints involved in this. I don't think it is right to have it come from one particular viewpoint, given that we're trying to be inclusive here. So I would like to have certainly the authors of all 3 documents that led into this agreeing in this goal. I think otherwise we're not going to find consensus. So
All right.
I'm very happy to work with all the other authors and with anyone else.
And I just want to make sure, Andrew, that I got your cue unqueued before, or did you have an additional comment?
I had an additional comment.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I'll cheekily add, though, that if other help is needed, as far as I'm able, I'll be happy to help with an effort. But the reason for wanting to just interject was I'm conscious that probably about 50% of the people on this call will have commented on the mic, and I think it'd be interesting to see whether any of the people that haven't commented to date have any strong feelings either way, or if they think it's really problematic to comment, because clearly that would be a useful learning point as well for this discussion.
And absolutely encouraged. There's an interesting double bind there, but yes, thank you. Bron, you had yourself in the queue, but did you have an additional comment or?
No, I think that's just what I said already. Was yes, I'm happy to do the document. I'd like to work with ideally a diverse set of authors on this.
Excellent. Robert, you were up.
So I'm not opposed to going the AD sponsored route. I don't, yeah, as I said, I'm not opposed to that, but I actually quite like your idea of having a quick spin up working group to focus on this document, and then to have a longer term mailing list. And my only reason for this, and maybe this isn't valid, is one of perception, that it feels like working groups are easier to find, see, and they turn up on the agenda and spot, whereas things that are just mailing lists and AD sponsored, I feel are slightly more hidden. You don't see them on the IETF 109 agenda, etc., etc. So it just from a sort of inclusive perspective, I feel that having a working group is easier for people to see and know where this discussion is happening, and not to exclude people. As to your comment about does a working group mean that it has to produce a document, I think that could be part of its charter, to say its charter is to investigate this, to try and produce a document if it's possible, but equally a valid outcome for the working group would be to say there should be no document here. So I think that would, from my perspective, would be an okay part of a working group charter.
Interesting. Colin, you were up.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, just fine.
Good. So I certainly think there are some good points in Ron's document, and I think it is written in a style that is quite familiar to a lot of people in this community, and I can see why people are perhaps focusing on some aspects of it. I think one of the strengths of the document that Mallory and Niels wrote, which isn't reflected in the other documents, is that it recognizes that we have a broader issue with inclusivity in the IETF community. And building on some of the other documents, I would be concerned we would perhaps miss that recognition and focus too much on a very narrow focus on particular terminology questions. So I would not think personally that Ron's document would be the right starting point for this group. Thank you.
Interesting. Victor, you just put yourself in the queue. Go ahead.
Right. I just wanted to counter that comment in that it is specifically on inclusivity that I find draft Nodell to be exclusionary and offensive in its terminology and its spin. So while some may see it as a positive virtue, I find it to be objectionable on many fronts and would not like to see it in any shape or form progress.
Fair enough. This is, I'm obviously Francesca and I are going to have to go back through the notes. Go ahead, Mira, please.
Everybody, I was struggling a long time if I want to contribute to this discussion or not, or if I can bring anything in that moves the discussion forward. The point I'm a little bit disappointed about is that like writing any document won't help. What will help is people change, people notice the problem, people caring about terminology, and having a discussion about this is hopefully the first step. Providing some recommendations is another step. Having a document about welcoming people, is nothing that will hurt, but I also don't think it will change anything. What will change is people raising the problem and people noticing it and then changing their behavior. Not sure if that helps the discussion for this specific document, but that's at least like my point of view for this discussion.
No, appreciated. Going into the mix. Adrian.
Yeah, thanks to Amelia for saying something rather important. I wonder whether, Pete, you feel the need to dispatch the documents or dispatch the topic, because I hear us moving towards, well, we should found our work on this document or we shouldn't, and at the same time, or previous to that, we seemed to have said, yeah, we need to have a document, and if you dispatch the topic, then the working group can sit down and work out what document it wants. If you dispatch the document, then you're kind of getting a jump on that working group.
Yeah, I started this discussion and mentioned up at the top that, we want to dispatch in general the topic and that the particular document was not essential. What I heard during this discussion was that people at least seem to be coming to consensus, it appeared to me, that dispatching something like Braun's document for this particular principled case was making folks comfortable. I would like to dispatch the topic in general, and maybe that becomes something closer to what Mary is talking about is, you know, how do we get people to be more inclusive, et cetera, and a single document, maybe that's, you know, coming up with ways to promote that idea. But yeah, I would love for there to be clear output on the whole topic. I wasn't hearing it yet.
So you may not be keeping up with the chat room
I'm trying
in WebEx, but there's a very quick exchange and +1s, etc., on just the idea of a broad inclusivity working group, which might pick up language issues as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be an example of you dispatching the topic, not the documents.
And I will mention that, you know, working group for that is one choice. IAB program for that is another choice. There are loads of ways to go forward in that area, but yeah.
Also, an inclusivity working group would very much clash with the idea of a quick
absolutely
that would close. So that's a different proposal.
Yes. I saw someone else. Bron, you popped into the queue there at some point.
If I wasn't clear enough before, I absolutely agree with Miria's points. I think it's important to have at least one of the authors, well, both the authors really, of the other draft involved in this as well. Mallory obviously ticks more of the inclusion boxes, but either way, we need to have them on board as well. Otherwise, we certainly don't have consensus. They are people who cared enough to make an effort in this. If we try and exclude them from the process, then we're definitely not reaching consensus amongst those who care here.
Right. Even though they called your document reactionary, that's cool, right?
Yeah, but I'm trying to form consensus, not to increase the fight here. Right. I would like to find something that they are happy with and that I'm happy with, and the rest of the group's happy with. If we can't reach that, we have problems. Yeah, that's what I signed up to do, right? I'm trying to find a consensus and a positive outcome here. Regarding the specifics of the working group versus AD sponsored, I don't have enough, I guess, knowledge of what's going to work better there. I leave it in your capable hands, Pete.
Yeah. Miria, you wanted to jump back in.
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons why we don't make good progress here is because we're jumping into this general topic of inclusivity, which is super important. I think we all agree that we have a problem and we need to do something, but it's very broad. And I don't think we agree what exactly the problems are and what exactly the measures are we don't want to do. So I'm not sure if like actually having more discussions about this on a mailing list, on working group or whatever will move us forward, because it's very different angles which need different measures. We do have some things that addresses this already, which is, for example, the mentoring program to get new people in. We have the ombuds team, which is an important part here and so on, but like it's very broad. So that's also why I'm a little bit disappointed about this discussion, because like I'm a member of the ISG, and when we put the statement out, we actually thought that this part about terminology is like one specific small angle of the big problem that is easier to address, and we can reach some consensus quickly in the sense that, you know, people should just watch out for it, they should be aware, and then everybody individually as an author should potentially consider this and change their behavior, rather than needing like broad consensus about this. So this is only one little piece of the puzzle, and as I said, I'm disappointed to see so much controversial discussion about this already. But having a working group that tries to include everything about this broad topic will probably not work out any better than what we've seen so far.
Yeah. John, I believe you queued next.
Yeah, I had a comment after Bron's comment, and now I'm confused. What part of what I'm concerned about here addresses a specific aspect of the inclusiveness issue, which is that we go down a path of looking at terminology in a way which itself becomes exclusionary. The comments about the initial draft which set this off are to a certain extent part of that discussion. It's a broader issue, but I think we need to be very, very careful. And that's why I supported Miriam's original comments, but am not quite certain about her second one. But I think we're on the same page.
All right, Keith.
Yeah, I actually think that, I mean, I don't want the outcome of this meeting to be let's recommend a inclusivity working group. I feel like that's a bit too soon, and there are some potential perils there. I don't want to dismiss those. I do think that by starting with this language topic, which it might have seemed like low-hanging fruit, but it might have actually created more controversy than necessary, because there are so many more glaring ways in which IETF is non-inclusive than that focusing on that topic might have actually kind of caused more heat than it otherwise would. Water under the bridge. I still think we have to address, because we've been talking about the language topic, that's really what we need to address now. And so I'd like to sort of see if we can settle on picking Braun's document as a starting point and moving forward with that. I have some preference for a mailing list over a spun up working group, but I could be persuaded either way. Not that I'm the one that's making the decision. Perhaps that's something that IESG would like to decide. But yeah, let's see if we can get that much moving forward, and then we can tidy up this meeting.
We've got 10 minutes left. Andrew.
Yeah, just sort of reflecting on some of the comments just now. I think if there were to be an inclusiveness working group, given that is a much bigger topic, it should only be on the basis that this document, whatever it results at, should be the first output from it, so it doesn't just get lost in a morass of a whole bunch of other stuff to be done. And also learning from the last document that was pushed out by the IESG, I think it should be a requirement that any output on this document, and I still think Braun's document is the right starting point, should be issued well in advance of the next IETF meeting, because I think it was deeply unhelpful that the last document was issued a week beforehand to the mailing list, when there's already plenty of other stuff for those of us that were focused on IETF 108 to be working on. So that just showed perhaps a lack of knowledge of the work that goes on before a meeting. So having a milestone that has to be more than a week before the next meeting is important, and that we shouldn't lose focus on the terminology. So if there is to be an inclusiveness working group, I personally think that'd be a fantastic thing. But if that's to be the case, this should be the first output, and it should be done in a timely manner, and not lost to be done in a few years' time.
I'm hearing, thanks, I appreciate that. I'm hearing that people think we might be able to get a principal document on the language stuff done, and that something bigger on inclusivity is a good thing in principle, but maybe not something that we think we are ready to dispatch out to. I mean, I haven't heard real objection to having some sort of working group program, whatever, on inclusivity, but that I'm hearing a lot of objection to it being something we can dispatch right now. Does someone want to disagree with that assessment? John, you can jump in.
Pete, I don't know if it's disagreement or not, but my view of the inclusivity problem isn't an issue of documents and what documents get produced in what order. Issue about whether we are changing vocabulary or changing whether our primary target is to change vocabulary or our primary target is to change how people think about these things and behave, rather than, as I say, what specific documents we try to produce to improve the IETF or perhaps humankind.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mary.
The goal is here to change behavior, to change our culture, but this is not something that we will achieve by writing an RC. It's something that we can only achieve by people changing their behavior individually on small steps. And for me, actually, recommending terminology and making people aware of that is one of those small steps. There are many more, right? But just writing it down in a document in an RC doesn't help.
Right. But let me ask you to stay at the mic for a moment. You don't have, do you have objection to going forward with a document about the language issue, independent of whether we do other things to sort of promote the change of behavior?
So I personally think that if we have a document about the language issue, it should very clearly state the problem and not only talk about measures. I think that's important for the community to understand and to agree to.
Got it. Bron, go ahead.
I am struggling a little bit with this. Part of the issue here is that to get people to change individually, there's really two ways. There's pacing and leading, which is getting them on side first and then leading them to a better place. Or the alternative is pretty much to kick out the people who are not on board with the program. You need to persuade people to change. Otherwise, you are forcing them to change. And I think the forcing to change is something that particularly the Eastern Europeans were particularly concerned about by the way they saw this happen on the mailing list, where they were being told to behave differently because they're bad people. And I think this leads back to the bad dog problem, that if you hit your dog and call it bad for doing the wrong thing, you will not get a well-behaving dog out at the end of it. And so the path we need to follow to persuade the IETF to change is not going to be a top-down telling them to change. I don't think that will work. And so I'm looking for a path that persuades people, not a path that tells people what to do, because I don't think that will be successful. It may get published, but I don't think it would change the behavior of the participants.
Keith, go ahead.
Something I've observed in IETF for a long time is that when we get rough consensus on a decision. We don't necessarily have rough consensus on the motivation. And that's a really useful distinction. So if we're looking at language specifically, if we focus on getting consensus around language guidelines, that's a lot easier than getting everyone to agree on the reasons for why we're doing this. So nobody has to agree, for instance, that we're doing this in order to overcome structural inequity that has been perpetuated by culture wars, whatever argument that you want to make. It's better if we don't have to go there, because we'll never get consensus on that. Because frankly, there's a real strong temptation for people to get religious about such things without pointing any fingers at anybody. So let's try to focus on the measures that we're going to pick, even though I agree, in general, attitudes have to change, and that's what makes things, change broadly. But we can't tell people what attitude to have. That's probably not going to work.
Arian?
We have 3 minutes left.
Miria?
Yeah, to reply to this one directly, I do agree. Like it's super hard to get agreement on the problem. We are better in documenting what the outcome is. But in this case, the only way for people to change is actually, agreeing on the problem, accepting the problem. If we try to mitigate this and we just describe, what we want, we don't solve the problem. And I mean, as I said, I don't think that that an RFC is the right instrument here. But like, if you want to try an RFC, I think that should be the goal, trying to actually tackle the problem.
Keith?
I emphatically disagree. I think if you want to create a nuclear explosion, that's the way to do it.
It's interesting because even as I heard Braun describe it, describing that we want to be inclusive, a good thing, right? And had that as a principle of what he takes to be the document. To a certain extent, that implies the inverse, right? That by not using these, by not thinking about this terminology, you're being exclusive. And that is a problem. And now, I mean, you can put it in the contrapositive. That's possible, but I'm wrestling with trying to get those things to match.
Right, but there's a difference between saying we want inclusivity and it's a good thing, and saying you're being exclusive in these particular questionable ways, and pointing fingers at people and saying you are, whatever, privileged racists, right?
Pointing fingers is always problematic.
Right.
Because then you're again characterizing the motivations of particular individuals
or the community.
Well, again, we want to avoid motivation, right? And perhaps go in with the assumption that people are trying to do the right thing. That doesn't mean that they are accomplishing doing the right thing, and saying that they are not accomplishing it is okay.
That's why I'm saying Braun's document is good, and its contrapositive isn't, the logical equivalent. It is. There's a difference. I'm comfortable with we want to do better.
Interesting. Oh, Braun, I didn't see you pop back in. Go ahead.
I have a question, I guess, for Miria and possibly for Juliana as well, which is, are you asking or requiring this document to say the IETF is currently bad and exclusionary and is using bad language? Because that is how it's reading. And I think that is the thing that a lot of people object to. Does this document have to say we have used bad language in the past, we are using bad language now, in order to achieve the objective you're trying to achieve here?
If either one of you want to jump in, go right ahead. I mean, to say for myself, Braun, the framing it as bad is already the leap, right? Framing it as language we've used has been exclusionary or hasn't been as inclusionary as it could be. Those I have a hard time distinguishing. Bad is I don't know, overly simplistic. But yeah, go ahead.
We are 2 minutes over time right now, so I think we need to conclude.
Yeah.
The meeting.
All right. I mean, I hear what I think I hear what's going on, and that people think we can get a more positive sounding principles document on language, potentially, with certain reservations out. I haven't heard a strong feeling about the forum that happens in. I've heard some people like Keith want to say, let's just do a mailing list and be done with it. Others pushing more for a short-lived working group. And I'm definitely hearing that we want to address the bigger issue in some way. Yeah, we'll go through notes, both the Jabber and WebEx chat and Francesca's notes from the meeting, and try and come up with a summary of all this and get it to the list. The next steps, we're gonna, we're going to try, Francesca and I are going to try to summarize this whole thing, get it up on the list, and we're gonna look for specific points that we want to hear agreement or disagreement about, and see if we can come up with a set of dispatches, both on the idea of a document and on the idea of future work in the larger area. Francesca, any other final comments?
No, I think it would be useful if people would go to the minutes and try to read your input if you remember what you said, because I am sure I missed something. So that would be very welcome. Otherwise,
And we will
I
try
agree
and...
with...
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I agree with what you heard. I also heard the same.
Okay, so we'll try and capture everything from the chats and bring those into the minutes as well, and we'll bring it to the list. And please do speak up on the list, and I think we are honing in on ways forward here. I'm not worried that we've ended up in where we began. I think we actually do have some potential paths here, but let's let us both summarize for the list and see if we can get those done. All right, we're 4 minutes over time. Thank you both all for participating, and we'll get something out to you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a good evening for those of you who are having an evening, and day for the rest of us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.